That was fast. Yay! Hello, everybody. I am waiting for Sammy to log in. We're about to have a conversation about his book. And yeah, I'll just also wait for some of you guys to log in. Hola, Patricia. Hola, Joanna. Thank you so much for being here, you guys. Oh, and there's Sammy. All right. Prove Sammy.
I haven't been equipped to do that.
Oh, my Alexa's responding. Hi, Sammy. Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah, you're buffering a little bit, but that's cool.
Okay.
So, yeah, good morning. I can hear you. I can hear you and I can see you. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon also, or good evening for some of you. Today, we're going to be discussing this beautiful, very thick book co-written by Sammy Buchamais, who's here with me. We have some formal introduction that we have, hi from Brazil, hello, that we have planned. So I will get to those right away so that we can get to the meat of the discussion. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Meiver de la Cruz, and I am currently at the dance department at Scripps College, teaching in the areas of critical theory, dance technique, and research methods in gender studies, what here at Scripps we call MENA studies, and dance and performance studies. And my guest today is Sammy Abu Shamais, who's a violinist, vocalist, and rababa player, co-founder and musical director of Sakrayat, a project that I am a big fan of, that I've interviewed him about before many years ago. He's a teacher and scholar of Makam and Arabic music. He has taught classes and lectures at Yale, the New School, Wesleyan University, the College of William and Mary, Al-One for the Arts, Lark Camp. He also has reached thousands of more students through his online lessons via makamlessons.com, as well as here through Instagram, where you do a ton of generous free instruction that we're so grateful for, and YouTube as well. Sammy also works as an arts advocate and administrator, and is currently the deputy director of Flushing Town Hall, a multidisciplinary arts presenter that serves the diverse communities of Queens, New York, with music, dance, theater, puppetry, visual arts, film, and arts educational programs that celebrate the varied cultural backgrounds of the borough. So welcome, Sammy. Thank you so much for being here. As an activity description, I will say I am a light-skinned brown woman with purplish, brownish hair, a little bit below my shoulders. I'm wearing a navy sweater. I'm wearing glasses. And behind me, there's some flowers, some books, and a portrait of Frida Kahlo on the other side of me. And Sammy, I invite you to also do a self-description.
Yeah. I'm Sammy Bouchamais. I'm a white passing Arab American male with very short hair, wearing a black shirt, and behind me is a yellow wall and another bookshelf with maybe books we'll talk about.
Maybe books we'll talk about, for sure. And I also want to do a land acknowledgement to you. I'm speaking to you all from the unceded land of the Tongva, Gabrielino, and Key Nations. I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation of this, and I apologize. It's the Torojoanca, or Claremont, California, as it is known, this land. And I would like to express my support for their ongoing struggles as the right stewards of the land, and also take an opportunity to reflect on how land acknowledgement might become a practice of imagining planetary justice for indigenous populations around the world, considering especially how, for those of us in the United States, U.S. foreign policy contributes to the infringement of rights to land for indigenous populations across the world. States, also known as Turtle Island, also known as the United States. So yeah, and Sammy also wanted to do.
Sure. So I'm going to use the land acknowledgement that we developed with Flushing Town Hall, because I'm also in Queens, New York, where I live. And in conversation with Matinecock tribal elders who are still active in Queens County, we developed this in conversation basically with the tribe. So I acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Matinecock people, the first people of Queens, New York, one of the original tribes of New York City, who still live and work on the land to this day. And we honor the elders who have stewarded their land throughout generations.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so I first proposed to Sammy that I was going to describe, this is my method. I was going to describe my experience with the book briefly as someone who is not a musician. So the book is called Inside Arabic Music. And I wanted to talk about the approach to writing it that you guys took, that intentional approach. But I said I was going to first describe some of the content. Like, just gonna want to give our viewers an idea of like a quick table of content of what's in here, and highlight in particular the things that have stood out for me and been most intelligible as a who dances to an artist who works using Arabic music. So I think the introduction is really lovely. First of all, it's really easy to read. The style of writing is very accessible. And the book is over 400 pages, which I want to ask how long that took to put together. It's really impressive. In the introduction, the authors talk about the golden age of Arabic music, kind of a description of Maqam. And you guys frame Arabic music as a primarily vocal tradition, which is something that I want to ask you to talk a little bit about today. And then the next chapter talks about melodic instruments, the traditional instruments in Arabic music. And it describes the instruments as well as, I think what I like about the instrumental descriptions or the instrument descriptions is that they're a good guide for people wanting to buy. Like if you wanted to buy musical instruments, it tells you like, your nail should not be too thick and not too thin. Like, there's all these details about what's a desirable and appropriate musical instrument. Then it talks about how.
And who are the right performers to listen to on that instrument?
Also, yeah, a list of exemplary performers. Yeah. Then it talks about Western instruments that have been Arabized for their use in Arabic music. So what do these modifications of Western instruments look like? For example, accordion, keyboard, piano, electric guitar, saxophones, and so on. Then there's another chapter on percussion instruments, detailing a lot of their specificities as well, and structural and sound wise. And then there's a chapter on different sizes of ensembles, from the taht ensemble, mid-size ensemble, the Arabic full orchestra, the Raqs Sharqi orchestra. So there's a small section specifically on that. The Arabic pop ensemble and Arabic choirs, the role of the conductor, some differences in when that would be used. And one thing I think that talked about in this section is like the lack of mistakes in Arabic music. It's also something that so much is improvised that there's not a lot of room for making mistakes. And I wanted to also talk about that with you a little bit. And then the next chapter is on ornamentation and stylistic and regional ornamentations, and the cross-pollination on ornamentation styles between different regions, which I found really interesting. Then there's not a chapter on rhythms that is not detailing the rhythms, but it's a conversation about the use of rhythms is kind of how they are usually ornamented, how tempo is kept when you play, the relationship between rhythm and melody, the structure of a solo, a percussion solo, and where that fits into a composition or an improvisation. And then, so those are the first 100 pages of the book. And then after that, the next section, chapter 7, is a detailed description of Arabic rhythms, their structure, and it's a really impressive list. So it's a really great resource with a lot of information about different rhythms, the more popular and common ones, as well as more obscure ones. To me, at least in my knowledge, right? And then some forms talking about the muasha, talking about the taktuka, and many others. Then instrumental forms, so song forms that are instrumental, and also styles for arrangement, the tuning system, notation systems, segments of makam, so the jins, and the most common ajna, and then a whole chapter on makam, a whole chapter on modulation, Sair, the Taksim, which is also something that I told Sammy I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Taksim. And so there's a chapter for instrumental improvisation and voice improvisation and the different style and practice of that. A chapter on Tarab, and a whole bunch of information on Makam, quite extensive as well. So it's quite a triumph. There's a lot here. And I wanted to first start by asking you, Sammy, about the process of co-writing this book. How long did it take? And something that you say in the introduction is that this is a living tradition, and that you guys are wrote the book that style, kind of a documenting something that's living and organic. So I wanted to ask about that process.
Absolutely. And there are a few other things that you mentioned in your introduction. Thank you so much, Meiver, for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I'm really delighted by your interest in the book. The process was a long process. And it's really, a lot of people have observed it's kind of two books in one. There is the broad overview of topics that would be really relevant to, introductory readers. And then there is Maqam content that is not just a sort of a replay of Maqam history, but actually an attempt to rewrite Maqam theory.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes very deep into Maqam. At the same time, it's very broad in attempting to cover a whole bunch of topics. So the two books in one is actually goes to this process of writing it. The book was started by my co-author, Johnny Faraj, the creator of the Maqam World website. So he had this vision of creating an introductory book for Arabic music, because when he and I first started learning about Arabic music, there weren't really great books in English to really introduce the whole topic. So he had this basic idea, and he actually started drafting in 2008.
Mm.
Now, I collaborated with him on the Maqam World website back between 2001 and 2004. So he and I have been sort of having conversations about Maqam, about Arabic music, and playing together in Zikrayat. He's sort of been a member of Zikrayat since 2005. And we work together in so many ways that we've sort of had this ongoing dialogue about both Maqam, but also about Arabic music and our approach to it. And one of the things that you highlighted when you were introducing the book, right? These details about the right instrument to buy or who to listen to. our approach to writing the book, which again, I give credit to Johnny for coming up with the vision, was to produce something that would be practical. We do want to be informative, but we want to be informative very specifically in the way of things that will invite people to come and participate, right? So a living tradition, as you observe, is something that needs people to participate in order to keep living. So that's the beginning framework. We wanted to think about it from a practical point of view, and then even the theory, even the deeper theory parts of the book, are also framed from that perspective of how does theory match with practice? Right. Rebuilding theory from describing practice rather than setting up rules. So in terms of the process of doing this, so Johnny started in 2008, and he had a full draft by the time he invited me in 2013. In the meantime, I had my first article on maqam theory in Music Theory Spectrum was published in 2013. I had actually submitted in 2011, been working on it, sort of in parallel to Johnny drafting the book, where I introduced some of my innovations in maqam theory that had lived on the Maqam Lessons website. And that paper was very well received by those in academia because I sort of presenting a new approach. So Johnny invited me in 2013 to be initially a consultant on the book. He wanted to see my take on also Western music, because I have training in Western music theory and composition and all that stuff. And also to talk about maqam. And as I started coming on board through a year of conversations and discussions and arguments, we're two Palestinian men, so, we're opinionated. We realized that my contribution was more than a consultant, that we kind of came to a point where we decided to include my innovations in maqam theory. So that's how it kind of morphed into being, we sort of scrapped a lot of the old maqam content and rebuilt it. So in a way, the two books in one is really Johnny and me. Johnny had this vision for something that was very broad, introductory and accessible. I had a vision of how to present a new way of looking at maqam theory, but I needed Johnny to help hold me to the approachability factor. And both of us shared that commitment to, I would say, oral tradition as the source of true knowledge, and practicality as the goal of the book. And I'll say one more thing before I pass it back to you for your next question, because you mentioned, we talked about land and different cultures. I think it's important to note, right? We say in the introduction to the book, this is a book that is not about Arabic music in all 22 Arab countries. It is about the tradition from Egypt and Syria that was practiced in the mid-20th century. We say, for better or for worse, right, this is the most popular tradition. It's what people know of as Arabic music, but it does not include, say, North African music or music from Iraq or the Gulf. It does not include those traditions. There is a lot of relation among these traditions. There's a shared history, the melodic system, rhythms are shared. But we're trying to be very specific, and that specificity, I think, is important for people who are outside of Arabic music or outside any music tradition. There's a way to think about, oh, okay, I'm going to study Arabic music. But if someone came from China and said, I want to study American music, I'm going to study American music, your first question would be to them, okay, are you talking about blues, jazz, rock? What is American? Are you talking about music from Kentucky? Are you talking about music from Louisiana? Right? Music, when we're in it, when we're inside a tradition, we're very attentive to regional differences and specificity, but sometimes when you're outside, you kind of lump it all together.
Yes.
So I want to highlight that as, you know, we had to make a choice. We had to make a selection. It's the tradition that we are participants in. It's the repertoire we know and love.
Yeah.
But it's important for people to understand that within any music tradition or any cultural tradition of any kind, cultural specificity down to the city, down to the neighborhood is often very important.
Absolutely. And created all the in which those differences highlighted in the text, which comes up multiple times. When, for example, signaling to and the fact that there are other Russia and Iraq and so forth. So in Africa, so there were many places where I saw that thing of this is not everything, and I appreciate it. You also brought up know each other from Sikrayat, and some folks who are here might know that project. So you might saying a couple of words about it
Sure.
before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Zikrayat is the ensemble that my wife and I started here in New York. My wife, who is Demish, a fantastic belly dancer, dedicated specifically to two things, I would say. Dedicated to music of Egypt and Syria and this repertory, but also dedicated to bringing music and dance together in a way that sort of highlights the artistry in both, and through this lens of Egyptian film. We really love this mid-20th century Egyptian film repertory because it has a number of things that are really appealing. It has the full richness of Arabic music in the maqam system, but it's very accessible. It's not as heavy as some of the earlier repertory, what's classically known as tarab repertory. It's accessible to dancers, and I love dance music, and I love serious classical repertory as well. So it was sort of an attempt to combine different repertories and different musics, but within that frame of Egypt, and a little bit outside of Egypt in Syria and Lebanon and so on.
Right.
So we work with a number of great dancers, and I have a number of wonderful musicians that I get to work with in New York City.
When did you start it?
We started in 2005.
So I want to point that out because you guys were reenacting golden era Philippines with live music and choreography with an ensemble that was primarily dancers of color since 2005. And I just want to make that point because important things that you guys were doing so early on in terms of celebrating that tradition. Also popular music, right? It had classical elements, but it was popular music at the time. So it has that appeal, it has that danceability, and it has nostalgia and memory for people that is very emotionally endearing. So yeah, so I love it. Okay, so moving back to the book, in the introduction, you guys talked about Arabic music as primarily a vocal tradition. Even when you introduce the Taksim chapter at the end of the book, you say it is division. It comes from that word division because instrumental solos where you break up or partition vocal songs or vocal performances, longer vocal performances. And that's where Taksim comes from, which was super interesting to learn. So tell me about primary vocal tradition.
So I'll start by saying that the melodies of maqam, so maqam is really a melodic system. Without getting into technicality about scales or anything like that, maqam is a body of melodies held in oral tradition. And there's a lot of shared melody from religious music to secular music. And there's a long history in the Muslim world of music being controversial, let's say. Debates within Islam about whether music is acceptable or not, debates about whether dancing is acceptable or not. This has been going on for thousands of years. It's the same debates that happen in Christianity and in other religions. But in the Muslim world, one consequence of this, of the religious debate over music, was the elevation of vocal music. Specifically that, obviously we're talking about kind of a debate between conservatives and liberals,
Right.
where religious conservatives want to prohibit music and liberals want to include it. And that's, goes down 1,500 years ago. But the one thing that the conservatives agreed about is that vocal music is okay. And that it's okay to have vocal music with drums accompaniment only.
Oh, wow.
And this comes from specific sayings of the Prophet, where he didn't say that music was wrong, but he did say that vocal music with drums is always good, right? So there's, people are parsing this stuff in a way that I personally find a little bit silly, but the consequence is that the recitation of the Quran, the recitation of the call to prayer, are two of the most important sources of melodic content for this music. And the Quran is almost never spoken. It is sung. The word is recitation or read, but it's read with melody, with maqam melody. Now, these melodies are also the melodies that were present in the region beforehand. We're talking about melodies that have been around for probably thousands of years, melodies that are part of the Jewish and Christian traditions of the region, melodies that cross from inside and outside religious institutions and general song. And there's this long connection to sung poetry in the Arab world. The qasida, and the poetry was always sung. So you have these roots in both religious chant of different religions, and you have these roots in sung poetry. Sung poetry was also popular around the Mediterranean. The Greeks in their plays had choruses that were always meant to be sung. So singing has always been important. And Arabic music in the contemporary times is really structured around a certain reverence to the voice, in the sense that what we see in the 20th century, and I'll just go to Kulthum, right? So Kulthum is an exemplar of a lot of things that we see. And you see that Kulthum as a vocalist is leading and driving the ensemble. That she is making decisions about what she's going to sing next. And the ensemble is following her. They're revolving around her. They're copying her. They're copying her style. As a violinist myself, I copy vocal style. I learn maqam from the voice as much as from violin players. The repertoire is very vocal centric, and in contrast with, say, Turkish music, where you have a much wider body of instrumental repertoire, there is much more vocal repertoire in Arabic music than instrumental repertoire. And half of our instrumental repertoire is Turkish instrumental pieces like samais. There was definitely a growth of instrumental composition in the 20th century, especially for dance specifically. And so I don't want to say that instrumental music is not there, but as you pointed out with the Taqsim, the tendency is to have instrumental and vocal music blend together, and it's very rare to have purely instrumental music in the Arabic tradition. You almost would never have just at least historically, just an instrumental concert. You would have something with vocalists and with dancers, and instrumentalists would have their moment in the sun to play solo, but there's almost always a voice involved in the music, except when the vocalist needs a rest for about 5 minutes.
So someone that said more about the poetry, I want to say that chapter 8, my silly clips, but chapter 8, when the authors are discussing the song form, really in about this, about the relationship of song structure and metering, I guess, or structuring. And yeah, so I wanted to ask also about this flexibility in performance. That there is, you guys in some ways describe that there are there's a lot of content that is culturally embedded. Yesterday when we were sort of planning this conversation, you talked about it as a vocabulary. In the book also you do that. So there's this sort of fragment segments as well as ways of proceeding or arcs that are culturally familiar. And then but there's like the space for ornamentation or spontaneous creativity in the playing at the moment. And I just love that so much. As dancers are invited to respond to all of these kind of details and nuances of that beautiful ornamentation. Could you talk just a little bit about that? You also frame it as like a low chance of making mistakes, or basically that there's no mistakes, that that there's a kind of tension there, even with pieces that are well known, right? Just like in the pure improvisation, which I want to talk about separately, but even when playing pieces that are well known, that there are also the signal. Talk about the signal between musicians, and I kind of wanted to hear a little bit about that, about all that happens in that live moment, that always spontaneous in some way. And that's really hard, I think, for folks from the music tradition to understand. And it's why in the musical traditions is so important for dancers. Like, we really are not able to do a good job performing and to this music unless we understand all these nuances, which is why I think this is such an important resource. And I wanted to hear you all that spontaneous, even in like the rehearsed or known repertoire.
So let me go back for a moment to Thum, because I was talking about her. Thum, when she would perform one of her long songs, one of those like 45-minute songs that she became very popular for, the story goes that she would rehearse the band like 50 or 60 times before going on stage. When she was on stage, she could do anything she wanted, and they would immediately know what she was doing and they would follow her. So she could make a decision to go back and repeat a verse. She could repeat a line. She could start improvising whenever she wanted over a line and know that the musicians would be there. So the point that I want to draw from this is that the spontaneity is possible because everyone sort of knows the same playbook. So improvisation and spontaneity, and we're talking about improvisation not as in pure improvisation within the framework of composed songs.
Right.
There's this way that people will all know the same song, and they'll know it so well that there's this expectation that you're going to mess with it. There's this expectation that you're going to change it. Yeah. And there's an expectation that different instruments are going to perform it differently. So the one thing for people to understand is that Arabic music is not primarily a harmonic music. So it's not a music where the different instruments are playing different parts of a harmony or a polyphony like you have in Western music. Everyone is playing the same melody, basically. So when you have the violin playing a melody, and then you have the oud playing a melody, and the violin is bowing, and the oud is playing this, and the qanun is doing this, and the nai is blowing this, and the singer is singing the same melody. They're all singing that same melody. They're each going to articulate it differently, right? The long notes of the violin versus the short notes of the oud. And so there are particular styles of ornamenting and decorating that are obviously distinct for every instrument, but also in this case distinct from the what are called the sahib, I'm blanking on the word, the elongated sound versus the plucked sound, the percussive sound of melodies from the plucking. So those major differences, you're doing the same melody in those ways, means that in a way, any song lives in different interpretations. And those different interpretations are layered on top of each other. And the oud, the community of oud players has their particular vocabulary, and the community of violin players has their vocabulary, and the community of etc. And they're all bringing that together, and there's an expectation that you're also going to express your individuality as a performer. And the question is, and this goes to an ensemble question, is who and how many people have the freedom to fully express themselves individually? And what are the parameters? So in a really small ensemble, and you mentioned the Takht ensemble, where you have one melody player for each part, violin, nai, oud, and qanun, and one percussion or maybe two percussionists and a singer, there's a lot of freedom. The vocalist is still the king or queen, and the percussionist's job is to be in sync with the vocalist rhythmically. And then the melody players can play within that framework. And as long as they're supporting the melody and not going over top of the vocalist. Whereas on the other hand, if you have an ensemble like a 40-member orchestra, like some of the larger orchestras that develop for Kulthum and Abdul Halim, there has to be less room for flexibility. But there's still an essential character of the music that people expect, that listeners expect, is this multi-layered thing. So there's still always some room, but it's a little bit narrower because you have to unite a large ensemble. But it's this cultural expectation that things are going to be done differently to show off who you are. But then the question is, it's sort of a negotiation within an ensemble or within a performance as to who is the biggest star. And usually it's the vocalist, unless the vocalist isn't there. Why don't you redirect me a little bit? I've answered part of your question, but not all of it.
Well, no, I think that you have answered the question in terms of addressing how that ability for improvisation and the individual expression has room, more or less context limited or expanded room to exist and make itself manifest, which explains for dancers then why two recordings of the same song are not expected to be the same, right? It's not that they are not the same because the musicians are willful or whatever, but it's that there's not a cultural expectation that should be the same, because those are different musicians and they're supposed to be present to the different version and the recording. And
not only that, if you listen to an Kulthum song and you hear her, and I keep going back to Kulthum, I can't help myself, but it's true not just of her, it's true of any of the really great singers, especially from Syria.
My copy of Virginia Danielson back here, like, do I have it? Like, so I can when every time you keep
so when Kulthum or any other tarab singer repeats a verse, if they're going to repeat the same melody, they have to sing it differently the second time.
Right.
There's this expectation that the second hearing of the same verse, you're going to throw in some different ornaments. You're going to create a different expectation by moving your emphasis within the phrase or repeating a different part of the phrase, so that it builds that excitement for listeners. It builds that, like, there's drama even when you're repeating the same thing, because you don't know how it's going to end or where it's going to go. And that's part of that ecstasy of tarab, is this, yes, we're following a path that we know already, but there's going to be little differences in where they're going to come in, and where's the like little spices going to come.
And as a listener and as a dancer, there's that deliciousness of remaining connected, right? The flow that happens when you have to pay careful attention to what's going to happen, because it's different. And that, you know, whether you're working with a new recorded version of something that you know, or whether live musicians, there's that excitement about how is this
Right.
right.
And yeah, you know, I think that's the part of that's something I wanted to say more about, even within. So in an ensemble, you had asked previously about like how are the musicians communicating with each other. When you add dance, it's another layer of the same thing. So what we're really talking about is entrainment, almost, or
Yes,
sort of like the cognitive term.
yes,
Um, Scientists don't fully understand how is it the musicians get in rhythm together, but they notice that there's a psychological cognitive phenomenon of musicians playing together. They're not studied Arabic music, where people can develop the same sense of time when they're playing together. You add a dancer to the mix, and there's another layer. And there's also the audience. And we talk about this in the Sayr and the Tarab chapters. When you have an audience of educated listeners, and by educated, I don't mean people who've read Inside Arabic Music. I mean people who have listened for a long time. It doesn't have to
right.
be their whole lives, but an audience of people who have listened for years.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same mental expectations of where the music is going to go that the musicians do and that the dancers do. So this whole phenomenon of entrainment, which is entrainment to the beat, entrainment to the basic structure of the melody, entrainment to the bigger story of maqam,
Right.
is happening among the musicians, between the musicians and the dancer or vocalist, and between all the performers and the audience. And there's this simultaneous feedback loop that's happening with all of these parts kind of coming together. And that is the magic of music. And it's not limited to Arabic music, but I think we wanted to highlight that in talking about as like that's really the whole pie. That's really what it's all about, is understanding that music is not a solo phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon of someone composing something and that's music. No, music is the practice of bringing a composition to life by musicians playing together, working with dancers, and then an audience responding in a certain way. Because you know this as a dancer, when you're improvising, or as a musician who's really improvising, there will be moments when you do something unexpected and the audience will respond in a certain way.
For sure.
And that audience response then drives you as a performer to do more of that or to do less of it. And like, you know, sort of bait the audience, right? I'm sure you've had the experience working with a drummer on a drum solo, and the way that the drummer is playing with you and like, I'm going to give you this beat. I'm going to switch the beat. Can you catch me? Right? There's a playfulness that comes when people have a shared vocabulary. And again, to sort of bring it back to that, this expectation of play is rooted in knowledge of a shared vocabulary. And then once everybody knows that everybody knows the shared vocabulary, then the expectation is you're going to mess with it a little bit. And so that's the dynamic that's happening.
And that mess with it a little bit is, I think, also something that the audience, as you describe, is fully in on that expectation. And they are there for the playfulness. They're not there for a inert, not alive repetition of the thing. They are there for the specific, unique version of the repetition thing that's going to happen in that moment. That's what they're there for.
Yeah.
I think understanding that and understanding that circular flow of energy or affect, I would call it, that you described between musicians, composer who's doing a visual and body sound score, and the audience. That's so important. You know, working through to describe that in writing, very exciting for me to think through that and talk with you. So I wanted to move on talking about Taksim for that reason, because it's one of my favorite things. And in the chapter here, you begin with the word drama. Is the first word in the chapter, which I loved. Talking about particularities of it in a way that I think, you know, what is virtuosity? How does one find an individual voice within this traditional structure or ways of already doing the arc of it? How does it usually begin? How does it usually develop, expand in the middle, grow? What are the resolutions? You know, so this kind of arc. Could you just talk a little bit about? And we're talking about instrumental. So yeah, instrumental improvisation. I just wanted to disclose a little bit what's in here from that.
Yeah. So right, we talk about drama in the Taksim chapter. We talk about in the modulation chapter, a journey is the metaphor we use. And we use these metaphors because I think there's this expectation. So here we are talking about a music theory phenomenon. Like, what is maqam and how do you improvise? And I speak about vocabulary a lot, but to really understand how to improvise, we want people to appreciate that it is about what we were talking about before, how you take vocabulary and you mess with it. So the first starting point to understand is that there is an expected vocabulary for Taksim. There are expected opening phrases and expected closing phrases, melodic phrases.
That's so important because it means you can learn it.
It means you can learn it. Yes.
Learn it. Yes.
It means you can learn it, but it also means you have to learn it.
Right.
It means that you can't just say, I'm going to expect maybe there's a rule. It means that, and I'm going to illustrate. So I have my violin with me. And I'm going to illustrate some areas about Taksim just because I think it might be clearer to people. So can you hear me if I play? So I'm in Maqam Bayati, and it would be typical for me to start like this. I went to this note, right, which is like, I'm waiting for resolution. So obviously there's drama that starts from the very beginning, right? But this expectation that I'm going to go to that note in Bayati, right, it's going to happen so many times because there's this expectation among listeners, right? As soon as you hear, like you're a dancer, you're going to hear, right, there's a piece. As soon as you hear that rhythm, right, you know there's an improvisation started, right?
Yes.
What's the instrumentalist going to do, right? So, but then the first thing. Right? So there's that opening that sets the mood and that is expected. And there's a different opening for every maqam. And there's not only one opening for every maqam, but there are a limited number of them. So you can and must learn them. There's a lot of flexibility in the middle, and that's where the drama or the journey comes in. So again, in the maqam chapter and the modulation chapter, we talk about the metaphor of a bus journey or like the subway map, where you're going to different stops and you have different options. And we talk about a network of options. But I want to talk about that in terms of drama and contrast. So you can think of it, right, as the, I'm going to take a trip from A to B and I'm going to visit C and D. Here I am in New York City, and we use the New York City subway map, right? I'm in Queens. And if I want to get to Brooklyn, I could take a couple different trains. Maybe I want to stop and see one friend on the way. Maybe I want to stop and see someone else. There's a couple different stops I'm going to take. I can go any number of different ways. I don't have to go linearly. I can go here, maybe here, then there, and then there. And so I view Maqam as that kind of a open-ended structure with options, not as a linear pathway. The drama comes because each one of the different areas you can go to has a particular mood. So let me just demonstrate that here. So we have this mood that we established from the beginning. It has a mood. When I go here, the mood is very different. Okay? I can make the mood different again. You hear the difference among those three moods? Okay, so now let me talk about the drama. So we have these different moods, and each one of these is a different area that we can go to. And I want to illustrate the contrast between these two moods, right? So this first mood is what we call jins ajam. And then this mood is called jins rust. So now I'm going to play a little bit, and I'm going to go back and forth. And then there's this original mood that is bayati. So I'm going to go through just for a minute and play for people. And I may mention when I change the mood, but I want you to see if you can respond, because listeners in the tradition will often notice the change. So let's see. So here we are. You hear how I brought in that other mood? I made that change when I did this. I was here in the mood we call rust. And then I changed. And then I can go back. So then I ended in a different mood. Did you feel that, Meiver? Those different mood changes?
I hope, I mean, folks seem to be also dancing and enjoying and waving. Yeah, absolutely. So I felt the transition into a new mood at the end, but also when you start, like you kind of played for a long time, right? You played for a chunk of time, which also kind of has this feeling of like being able to linger in an idea together.
Yeah.
And that's really, really nice to be able to, you know, not feel like rush jump something, but being able to stay and get that you transform something new and we can stay connected. That sense of flow that happens is one of the most special, magical things that I appreciate about this tradition and the gift that it is in my life to be able to learn about it, train in it, and attempt to do a competent performance to it. And so much for
So there's something I want to highlight in just what
Yeah.
I just want to say
Yeah.
something for about a minute. So in what I just did, some of the stuff is known already, right? And some of this, right, it's vocabulary, and some of the stuff is decisions that I'm making in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to illustrate like how much of it is vocabulary and how much of it is new decisions, right? This, when I do this, that's vocabulary, right? Now I can play it differently. It's the same vocabulary played differently. When I do this, that's vocabulary. But the question is, so this, which is vocabulary in Jins Rust, versus Jins Ajam, which is this, both of them are vocabulary, but the decision when I go between them is my choice.
Is your choice. Yeah.
Now, to the larger Makam structure, the Makam Bayati that has these expectations that you're going to have this Rust and this Ajam and a few other choices, that's vocabulary, right? The path, the set of pathways is already existing. It was created by not one individual composer. It's not created by some set of laws in nature. It's created by the habits of a community. So the habits, when you hear 100 songs in Bayati and they all go a little bit to this Ajam and then a little bit to this Rust, and then they return to Bayati, if this happens over and over again in 100 songs, then those expectations are already in the neural networks of everyone in the tradition. And so then I can make a decision. So my improvisation within that framework is I already know what are my stops going to be. I know that I have to go to Bayati, to Rust, to Ajam, but I can decide when. I can decide how long to stay there. That's what you talked about, like the flow. I can spend time there, or I can move back and forth quickly if I want to.
Right.
But I can create, let me just illustrate that. Like I can create this kind of tension by jumping back and forth between the choices. So here's that. So I used like the back and forth between the Rust and the Ajam, back and forth, and then I waited, and then I gave you one resolution, and then I came back down to the Bayati. So so those are my decisions in the moment using the same structure that I did when I did the longer improvisation before. So there's a lot of choice.
Right.
And what I like to do when I speak to musicians, but it's the same is true of dancers when you think about dance vocabulary. Sometimes people think that learning vocabulary is limiting them, which is very naive.
Mm-hmm.
People think, oh, if I have to learn, no, I want to be free. I want to do whatever I want. Well, you and I are improvising right now.
Right.
Based on having learned a couple 100,000 words in English each.
Right.
We have a vocabulary, but then we can play with it. So it's a higher level of play. Improvisation is not happening at the level I'm making a decision every note. When you're improvising as a dancer, you're not improvising by like, I'm improvising every step. No, you're making a decision. I'm going to do this sequence. Oh, I'm going to move to that sequence. Oh, the music feels like it's going to that. You have components of choreographies that you've learned, right? If you learn an entire choreography, that becomes like if I learn a poem and I have 8 lines of poetry and maybe I'm going to use the phrase from here somewhere else, right? If I learn someone's taksim, if I copy and exactly memorize a different musician's taksim, it's again like learning a whole poem, but I can take one line from it and I can use it myself later. And it's not a limitation. It's actually giving you more content that you can then display, that you can then use. It's giving you more that you have. So vocabulary is incredibly enriching.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, thank you for that rich and musical and sonically also enjoyable explanation, Sammy. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of affirmation from chat from the folks that are watching. I think that this is also, I want to say Sammy teaches online on YouTube, here on Instagram, through his website as well, teaches individual lessons, teaches workshops and classes. So there's a lot of possibilities. Someone had asked again about the book. So the book is called Inside Arabic Music, Arabic Maqam Performance and Theory of the 20th Century by Johnny Faraj and Nice. And it is available on online booksellers.
Amazon, Oxford University Press, wherever.
Yeah, so it's published by Oxford University Press. And it is really fantastic. I have to tell you something. I developed a course a few years ago when I was teaching at Oberlin College called Music and the Body.
Music in the Body, you said?
Music and the Body. Yeah, and it was inspired by a course I took at Northwestern in grad school, but I wanted to infuse more. At the time was really to electronic dance, and I sort of transformed it into the other thing, thinking about like how does music theory appear in dance studies, and how do body and embodiment appear in music theory, right? And and I had a significant chunk of non-Western music theory there because things are cultural, and that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight to students, right? Many of them working in farms and in the case of Oberlin, working with Western classical music because that college is just music conservatory for Western classical music. But basically, I wanted to talk about specificities and the fact that this vocabulary can add so much to your performance, awareness, ability, and also your qualities as a person who consumes art in the world. Right? So yeah, in that unit I was using, Ali Jihad Rasi, Danielson, and Scott. I think also he reviewed some of this. I think that he's credited here. But I feel the book, if I were to teach that course again, provides so much of what I was fishing from different literature, right? So I was like using Virginia's book on Al-Thum and Ali Jihad Rasif, like the cultural tradition, Arab and Sultana, and that kind of stuff. And I feel like through this text is a good primer to get a kind of, like, for an introductory reader, to get a unified place from which to draw a coherent theory of all these different pieces. So I thank you so much for offering this resource to those of us interested in thinking about this and wanting to expose folks to other things and expand the logics of how as we think about performance globally. So it's an hour. I want to take your whole day, and also I don't want to live too long so that people actually watch it. But
well, the time flew. That was fun.
Time flew. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you so much for the resource. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you for reading it.
Watched. I really appreciate it. We're gonna keep the recording up in our accounts way, some fashion. And anything that you wanted to say before we wrap up, Sammy?
No, I'll just say, thank you for the shout out to my online resources. I am making those available on YouTube, free lessons for people who want to study this melodic vocabulary. But I'm kind of working on trying to develop some workshops and master classes specific for dancers, so I can find a way to communicate with dancers about maqam. I know that maqam has been a subject of interest, but also confusion. So I'm looking for ways to kind of try to make it more accessible. I hope that my presentation about the drama there was accessible, or to anyone out there who's listening. So I'm going to be working on that over the next few months. You might see me offering with different dancers some courses, some master classes on how to appreciate Makam.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to share and promote and help share your offerings with whatever audience I have, as I think your work is so excellent and so helpful to all of us. So
Thank you, Mary.
yeah, thank you so much, Sammy. Everybody for watching. And yeah, we'll both be sharing more some fashion through our accounts. So yeah, thanks for your presence here. We really appreciate it. All right, have a happy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.